Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Backlog Bunker. It's been a while, hasn't it? As much as I'd like to talk about why it's been a while, I don't really feel like doing that, so let's just get right into the games. Luckily, while I was gone, I really only played 2 games, so I don't have that much to talk about. And they're 2 games that I was already talking about on the Backlog Bunker, so I'm really just finishing my thoughts here before we eventually move on. The first thing we're talking about is Final Fantasy 7 Remake, which I finally beat. And not only beat, but I got 100% in, so no one can ever tell me that I don't know what's going on in that game. And upon replaying the entire game for 100%, I realized there are a lot of parts of that game that are just too short for any meaningful amount of combat. Like, if you're lucky in Final Fantasy 7 Remake, you'll get like 10-15 minutes of doing the combat without being interrupted by a cutscene, a walk and talk section, or a puzzle. Whereas in comparison, games like Fire Emblem Awakening or Dragon Quest XI will have much longer stretches of actual gameplay in between the story parts. And I'm not saying that all RPGs should have the classic structure of like dungeons where you just spend an hour or so disassociating until you get to the next part of the story, but what I don't want is the complete opposite, where my game is being treated like a social media algorithm, where all they want to give me is the short, bite-sized pieces of content that I watch a billion of, than just one long piece of content that I actually like. If I ever end up making another video about YouTube, I'm just gonna have it be like an hour-long rant about shorts. But, back to 7 Remake, it feels like everything that isn't the combat in the game is designed to stop the combat completely in its tracks. Even the puzzles are designed to be engagement-brained, since no puzzle repeats itself. So all of them have to be introduced and occasionally concluded with a cutscene, all of them have to have tutorial pop-ups to teach you how to do the puzzle, and then all of them have to be completely divorced from the combat. Take the sewer minigame for example, and yes, I'm calling it a minigame and not a puzzle because it's something to figure out, you just do it and you move on. You have an entire cutscene dedicated to going, wow, that water level sure is high. Hey Cloud, can you stand in here while me and Tifa do a minigame? And then you go and do an unfailable, unskippable minigame that only gets easier if you don't get it right, to then get another cutscene going, wow, we sure did lower that water level, to then finally progress with the game again. 7 Remake adds bloat in so many places that the original game didn't have it, only to then turn around and make the actual combat portions of the game shorter, because I'm sure I spent far longer doing actual combat in Final Fantasy VII than I ever did in 7 Remake. Despite the fact that 7 Remake is 10 hours longer than I ever spent on the original. This is of course not counting the 50 or so hours I spent getting 100% as previously mentioned, which by the way, was not very fun. I originally chose to do it because it seemed pretty easy, but all it did was exaggerate a lot of the game's flaws to me, especially the story parts and all the bloat, that you can't skip by the way. I suppose the thin silver lining to hard mode's difficulty spike was that I actually got to spend more time on the combat, but considering that 7 Remake's combat isn't very deep, nor does it present you with many options, being on hard mode didn't actually make the game more fun, it just made it take longer. I've said it before and I'll say it again, for all Final Fantasy VII's faults, that game interested me. I didn't like it very much and I think it's kinda bad, but it did interest me. Final Fantasy VII Remake is more of a AAA game wearing the skin of Final Fantasy VII. If I wasn't somewhat invested in Final Fantasy as a series, if 7 Remake was my first Final Fantasy game that I had ever played, I would not give a shit about this franchise. I'm not going to talk about the soul being missing or anything like that, because people who talk about the soul in video games are just beyond stupid. But even as someone who didn't particularly like Final Fantasy VII, this is how I imagine Final Fantasy fans feel when the series becomes more and more watered down as time goes on. Sakaguchi would be rolling in his grave, if he was, you know, dead. In other news, I finally beat Yakuza 8, which unfortunately means this video won't be getting many views, because as we know, all the people who say that I have bad taste never show up when I say something's good, it's only when I complain. So if it makes you feel any better, while I did find Yakuza 8 to be fun, it's a little hard not to be disappointed by it when it kinda just feels like it is what 7 should have been. Now, this isn't to say that I expect game developers to get everything right the first time around, especially if they're used to making a very different kind of game, but things like the job system or the movement in 7 were already pretty inexcusable, and I'm not sure how they ever got to the floor like that. Much like 7, I committed myself to doing basically all of the side content, and I will say that I enjoyed myself. However, I think the side content represents a pretty big problem that 8 faces due to the fact that Yakuza is now an RPG series. When Yakuza was a series of action games, I think it was more understandable to have a bunch of unrelated minigames or side modes, because sometimes you just want a break from the action. That's just how all action games are. Sometimes they take action breaks with like platforming or some other stupid shit like DMC does, but for the most part, as long as the side content is good, it'll make for a pretty good break. But with an RPG, the break from the action is usually supposed to be the story or the gameplay that serves the action. Take Xenoblade Chronicles for example. Whenever you're not directly participating in combat, you're either progressing the story, or doing things like side quests to get your affinity up, or making gems for your weapons. In Yakuza 8, you can do crazy delivery, Sicko Snap, or Mahjong until the sun comes up, but none of them will ever make you any better at the combat, the actual core of the game. I liked the Sujimon side quest, I did all of it, but at the end of the day, not only did the quest itself not make a meaningful impact on my gameplay experience, at least with the combat, the one impact it did make, that being the Sujimon role for Ichiban, didn't actually make an impact because it sucks, and I'm never gonna use it. Again, it's fine to just have minigames that don't directly impact the combat, but when that's all the minigames, and not all of the minigames are as good as the main combat, it kinda feels like I'm wasting my time. Though, speaking of wasting my time, Yakuza 8 brings back another Yakuza staple in that the story kinda sucks. Now, it's not quite as bad as 3 or 5, but it's barely as good as 1 or 2. The thing with Yakuza 1 and 2's stories are that they're mostly just fine. They're okay. And this applies to most of Yakuza 8's story. If anything, there are even some parts that I would say are pretty good. But near the end, it kinda falls off a cliff. Not to mention, this is now the 4th time we've gone, don't worry guys, Kiryu's definitely done this time. He won't be coming back. I won't get into the minutia of it now, you can read my review on Backlog for that, but the point is, I wanted this game's story to be good, and it just wasn't, and it kinda went out on a whimper. Then on a more minor note, the music. While listening back to a lot of the soundtrack after beating the game, there are a few songs in there that I like. Impregnable Triangle. I'm sure there's another one in there, which I really do mean. I'm sure there are other songs in that soundtrack that I like, I'm just not able to recall the names of them right now, which kind of speaks to the whole point that I'm trying to make, which is that 8's music isn't very good. The soundtrack is filled to the brim with EDM, electric, dubstep nonsense that it all blends together and sounds the same to me. Again, there were songs I liked, but the only song that ever stood out to me as like, oh wait, this is pretty good, was Impregnable Triangle, which is why I remember its name on the soundtrack because I looked it up. Which, by that metric, my second favorite song on the soundtrack would be A Hero's Holiday, which you might not know because it doesn't appear on the soundtrack, but that's the name of the fucking Win a Battle song. The victory theme you hear at the end of battles is the only other song on the soundtrack that I can remember by name, because I remember it being good, and again, I remember looking it up. Yakuza 4, a game I have not played for close to a year now, has 4 as in the number 4 face, both versions of 4 Faith, Broken Police Radio, Receive and Bite You, and many, many more. Now to be fair, 7 had this problem as well with all the EDM and dubstep, but the difference is that 7 had higher highs with like Enter the Tiger, Rolling Eyes Fall, Receive You the Hyperactive, and Ichiban's karaoke song, but also the fact that 7 wasn't the last Yakuza game I was gonna play, which pretty neatly ties us to the end of my now year-and-a-half long journey with Yakuza. Much like with Ace Attorney, the middling or bad games outnumber the good ones, but I can't say I regret my time with it. As an aspiring game developer, I did take a lot of inspiration from the Yakuza games. However, unlike Ace Attorney, I probably won't be playing an eventual Yakuza 9, because I feel like I've gotten everything I want to get out of the series. At the very least the mainline ones. I'm still going to play the Fist of the North Star game, probably still going to play the Judgment games, but beyond that, I don't really plan on continuing with anything new Yakuza. I'm just a little bit tired of, at best, playing a game and then going, it was good, but. I'm curious to see where the series goes from here, but for my part, it won't be any game that I'm playing. And it certainly won't be one that I'm buying. And now it's time for the weekly topic, and kind of in line with the end of my Yakuza journey, I wanted to talk about the fact that I've talked about a lot of franchises on the bunker, and I've expressed a desire for things like an Ace Attorney 7. But why? By which I mean to ask, when does a series actually end? When should it end? Ace Attorney 6 serves as a pretty conclusive way to end the series if they never chose to make another one. So is it simply because I like Ace Attorney enough that I want more of it? Is it because the story of Apollo's trilogy was so bad that I want to see it redeemed? Even if it was good, when would I want it to end after that? Would I theoretically ask for an infinite number of Ace Attorney games if they were all good? When would I be satisfied? And why is that not the case for Metal Gear Solid? If anything, Metal Gear Solid has some of the weakest endings in any game I've ever played, with 4 ending on, well, being Metal Gear Solid 4, and with 5 closing on a closed loop to the beginning of the series, story-wise at least. Gameplay-wise, it leaves itself open to much more Metal Gear, which I would be okay with, but I don't particularly want. So why is it that I desire Ace Attorney 7 so much, but I'm fine with not getting another Metal Gear? I think for a lot of games it can come down to storytelling potential, or if the last entry left on a high note or not. Like I said, Metal Gear Solid ended with a prequel that takes you back to the very beginning of the Metal Gear franchise as a whole. I'm not sure it can get more conclusive than that, whereas Ace Attorney 7, and DMC to a certain extent, did not end on a high note, and left themselves open for far more storytelling potential. I was originally going to use Danganronpa in this example because I'm fine with not getting another Danganronpa after V3, because V3 pretty conclusively ended that series, but I'm recording this on the day the Nintendo Direct came out, and we're getting more Danganronpa 2 content, so let's see where that goes. But then, even with individual games that are complete in their own right, both from a storytelling and gameplay perspective, like Kid Icarus Uprising for example, I want nothing more than a sequel to that game, so why is it different? Or, how about a series that I don't like Yakuza for example. I don't like Yakuza, I don't plan on playing the next Yakuza, but I don't want Yakuza to end, I still want there to be a Yakuza 9 as long as they still have stories to tell. But at the same time, I also wouldn't care if Yakuza ended today, because I don't like those games. But is it fair that Yakuza fans don't get any more games because I personally don't like them? Obviously not, because who cares about my opinion, but then that brings up the question of, well, whose opinion is it? Ryuga Gotoku themselves said they didn't want to make Yakuza games anymore, and so instead of Yakuza 7 being like Yakuza 6, they made it an RPG. Obviously they still make action games, but the point I'm trying to make is that if you're a Yakuza fan and you want the next Yakuza game to be like the other Yakuza games you already played and liked, Ryuga Gotoku themselves does not agree with you because they stopped making those Yakuza games. Going back to my own list of games, even among my favorites, I'm pretty split down the middle in terms of which ones I do or do not want sequels to. Dragon Quest XI, Donkey Kong Country, Kingdom Hearts, and Sonic are all series that I want to continue for one reason or another, while Fire Emblem, Terraria, the Arkham games, and Metal Gear Solid are all series I'm content with. And why is that? Some of these are easier to answer than others. For Dragon Quest XI, it's because I already know we're getting a Dragon Quest XII, it's just a matter of time, I think. For Donkey Kong and Sonic, they both have individual entries in their franchises that I adore to death, but want to see more of, at least in some form or fashion. Though of course you could argue that Sonic's a bit of a special case because I adore that series for a multitude of reasons. And Kingdom Hearts gets the special privilege of both knowing that we're going to get Kingdom Hearts 4 and needing a Kingdom Hearts 4 because Kingdom Hearts 3 did not end any of that motherfucking story. Then on the other side with like Fire Emblem, I don't know, I just think Awakening's the only game that I like in that series, so I wouldn't mind if it just ended because I'd only ever play Awakening anyway. And again, I'm recording this on the day of the Direct, so I know we're getting another Fire Emblem game in the Three Houses universe, which I think is a prequel to Three Houses. I haven't actually seen the Direct itself yet, but that's all I know of it so far. And I didn't like Three Houses, I didn't play Engage, and I don't want this one either, so I don't care about Fire Emblem, fuck it. Terraria is kind of self-explanatory, it's just a sandbox game, it's got a lot to do in it, so a sequel wouldn't really change any of that unless they overhauled, like, everything. I probably wouldn't mind a Terraria 2 that's just entirely new content, but that's also a lot to ask, so I won't be holding my breath anytime soon. Arkham is the rare example of a game series peaking, because Arkham Knight gave us not only the best version of the gameplay we ever got from that series, and probably ever will get, but it also ended the story conclusively. Ending well is a bit more up for interpretation, but it did end conclusively. I already talked about Metal Gear Solid, and Titanfall 2 is a multiplayer game, so I don't ever really want a Titanfall 3. It'd be cool, but Titanfall 2 kind of perfected multiplayer shooting for me, so I don't think I need more than that. Then the only game left in my top 10 is Fantasy Life, but Fantasy Life exists in a bizarre realm where, much like Kid Icarus Uprising, it was an individual game that was a complete package on its own, and the only thing I ever wanted was one sequel to that game, and then I fucking got it. I have yet to play it, but it's surreal in its own sense to see people give glowing reviews to the sequel to a shitty little 3DS game that I thought I was the only person in the world who knew and cared about it. I say all this to say, a series can't go on forever, but finding out when and how to actually end it is kind of impossible. It seems like for the most part, eventually a thing will just end, and you hope that's a good one. To turn this weekly topic into an actual weekly topic, it was brought up a little while ago that among the team that made the Sly Cooper games, like 10% of them would actually be interested in making a new Sly Cooper game. Meaning, as far as we know, that series is over. Cause of death? They just don't feel like making it. Much like our own deaths, we always hope for the ending that we want, but unlike our own deaths, we have much more room to be disappointed by the ending of a game series. But that's all for this week. I get out of here.